News. Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan, Sunday on CBS.
After the tragic loss of beloved newsman Tim Russert, his son went on a worldwide journey to find himself.
I struggled with his grief for a long time.
How Luke Russert is honoring the legacy of his father when we go person to person.
Two-thirds of the economists and the major leaders in the banks think we're not going to have a recession. I don't think it will either.
Every time the radical left Democrats, Marxists, communists, and fascists indict me, I consider it a badge, a great, great, beautiful badge of honor and courage.
The question is he the strongest to win the election? I don't know that answer, but can anybody beat Biden? Yeah, anybody can beat Biden. Can Biden beat other people? Yes, Biden can beat him.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. President Biden touted his administration's economic policies during a speech today in Chicago. He framed his agenda as a break from Republicans' approach to economic policy. This pitch comes as the president is quite evidently ramping up his re-election campaign. One problem, recent CBS News polling finds a majority of Americans think the condition of the economy is bad. Much worse than the president described today in Chicago. For more on this, Ed O'Keefe and Robert Costa join us now. Ed, as you well know, is CBS News' senior White House and political correspondent. Robert is CBS News' chief election and campaign correspondent. Ed, I want to start with you. We heard in the open of the show the president, before he got to Chicago, confidently saying there's not going to be a recession. That seemed to me to be among the most important things the president said, not just about the economy now, but where he thinks it's heading.
Perhaps more importantly, where it's headed, because that tape will be used against him in the court of public opinion in the coming months, should there suddenly be a recession. But this White House remains confident that one is going to be avoided, at least in the coming months, and continues to believe that the American people are going to come to understand why it is that they think the economy is doing so well, as all of the big legislation he's passed in the last 2 years starts to be implemented, as the money starts to get spent, as the airports start to get rebuilt, as the construction projects to fix climate change issues are done. It's just that it hasn't quite sunk in yet with the American public. They like to point out that, sure, on the question of is he handling the economy well, he's mired in the 30s. But when you talk about other more specific economic agenda items that have been implemented or are being implemented or that he's pushing for, they pull well individually with the American public. So it's now on them to sort of get it into the bloodstream and the mindset of Americans that, in fact, it is the president and his administration that's implementing these things. Remember, these numbers are bad as we look at them here, but we're looking at a record low unemployment rate right now. Economic growth, even though it may not be, as big as it was right after the pandemic, for example, or pre-pandemic, it is growing. Inflation, while still up above the 2% that the Fed would like, is coming off of the highs that we were seeing at various points late last year and early this year. So they're like, they got to get out there now and sell this, understanding that the economy is going to be issue number one going into next year.
Right. And I want to look at another part of our polling data about how assessments of the president's handling of the economy break down by party. And I want to focus in on the 69% disapproval among independents. Of course, there's a partisan breakdown. Republicans, 89%, are dissatisfied. 67% of Democrats approve. That's what we would expect. The thing that really fascinates me is 69% of independents, and the White House knows they've got to move that number. And as you also know, Ed, in politics, the mantra is don't tell, show. And that's what the White House has got to focus on.
And the problem is, the frustration they have is that they can't quite show it just yet because not all the shovels are in the ground, right? Not all the highways have been rebuilt, except for that one in Philadelphia that fell apart a few weeks ago because it just so happens to be in like the swing zip code in the swing city in the swing state that also happens to be a place the president knows well. And all the other money that's going out now for broadband expansion he was talking about on Monday, you're not going to feel that. You're not going to see it. You're not going to know somebody working on that project or who suddenly has Wi-Fi that didn't before for another year or two, potentially. And by then, politically at least, it might be too late. And so they got to get out there and talk about this as much as he can But look for them to find examples of the showing, not the telling, in the coming months. They're going to need them if they're going to close that gap, especially, as you point out there, with independents.
Robert Costa, you talk to a lot of Republicans. You're a bit out on the campaign trail, in addition to continuing to monitor the many legal issues encircling former President Trump, and we'll get to those in a second. When you talk to Republicans, how do they feel about the coming economic debate with Biden and re-election?
They feel pretty good about what it would be like in a general election, but it's hard to predict how the economy is going to be a year from now. At this point, there's a tension a bit between those in the Republican Party who want to advocate for wholesale change to long-term federal spending and those who do not. Trump, infamously or famously, depending on where you stand in the Republican Party, said he didn't want to tackle Medicare and Social Security in the same way former House Speaker Paul Ryan did when he was in power. And you see now former Vice President Mike Pence, he's arguing that on the economic front and fiscal front, America needs to tackle these issues to maybe calibrate and recalibrate the age of retirement, how these programs are allocated with federal dollars, how they're spending, and how big they are as federal institutions. And Trump is saying we don't want to touch them. And so that's really, I think, more on a fiscal front than an economic front, the argument. There's still generally this kind of Reaganite growth-oriented rhetoric inside the GOP Republican primary race right now, and that's not changing. It's the fiscal area that's the real divide. And
I know, Robert, you spend a lot of time going over what Trump's legal team is doing, but also what the former president says about various legal matters. And yesterday, it struck me, in New Hampshire and in flying back to Florida, he gave in one day 3 different answers about what happened in Bedminster, New Jersey, which is not a charged part of the federal indictment, but it goes to his questioning, or the question's been raised about how seriously he takes the handling of sensitive or classified information. Once he said there's no document, then he said there were documents, but they weren't classified, and then the other time he said it was bravado. To the degree that you can, assess how all these different answers from the former president either help or hurt the defense he and his team are going to have to ultimately mount.
Well, speaking of his team, it's evident, talking to allies of former President Trump, that his team doesn't have much control over their client. He is speaking about an ongoing case where he could face a trial in the coming months as he runs for president. And he's deciding to speak out in a convoluted, winding way about his intent and what he did. And so much of this case is about whether Trump had criminal intent to illegally hold records that were classified, to obstruct an investigation. And by giving all these answers in news media interviews, he's providing fodder for prosecutors to scour these statements and to potentially include them in a trial. Because just because you say something that's not under oath doesn't mean it can't be introduced as evidence.
Indeed, indeed. Ed, real quickly, from the White House, when you saw the president before he boarded Marine One for Chicago, you noticed something about him. Tell our audience what you noticed and what the White House has since confirmed.
Yeah, I don't know if we have an image of this, but our colleagues Gabrielle Ake and Willie Inman were out there this morning when he went to Marine One and took a few questions. And they and other reporters couldn't help but notice that there were these almost like strap marks right here on his cheeks. And we went back, you can see it there ever so slightly. We went back and looked, and there had been similar markings on Monday when he did an event here at the White House. So clearly he'd been wearing something. We asked the White House, what's up here? And we've been reminded that back in 2008, when he was picked as Barack Obama's running mate, he disclosed that he'd been treated for sleep apnea. This is something that affects about 30 million Americans. Common sleep disorder that basically can affect your breathing at night. It can cause you even to wake up if you stop breathing. But you can use a mechanism called a CPAP that you put over your mouth to continue giving you oxygen no matter what. You just have to wear it really tight. This is what I've been told. I'm no doctor. I'm no user of such a device, but this is what I've been told. So that's what that marking was. In essence, they confirmed he's been using one over the last few weeks. This is a common thing for somebody who has it. The sleep apnea had been revealed in his records back in 2008. There was nothing about it in his most recent medical report, other than to point out that he'd had some sinus surgery back in the day to deal with congestion. He, like many others, including this reporter, maybe you guys, takes a Claritin or an Allegra during allergy season and a nasal spray to deal with some of that stuff, a common thing. Of course, all of this against the backdrop of voter concern, well documented, not us, the voters, concerned about his age and whether he'll be fit to serve, but they were very quick to disclose that when it was pretty clear something was up based on the markings on his face.
And just to be clear, this is not a medical complication or issue. It's just a treatment for a very common issue that many Americans have.
Precisely, and it's why presidents are subject to such great scrutiny, because they are, after all, one of the most photographed people in the world.
No doubt about that. Ed O'Keefe at the White House, Robert Costa here in the studio. Thanks so very much. As we mentioned, President Biden is on the road this week, raising money, in part, before his next fundraising deadline arrives this Friday. Well, when we come back, the role his running mate, Vice President Kamala Harris, is playing in that process and the re-election campaign. You're streaming America Decides.
If it's important to our nation,
I wonder how you think about where America is at this moment.
it's on Face the Nation.
Can there be stability if Vladimir Putin remains in power?
Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education. Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News Streaming.
Welcome to America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
I always tell people that Twitter would not be Twitter without Black Twitter. It's just us being in fellowship with each other.
And it becomes a conversation you don't want to be left out of.
People really started to recognize the power of activism on Twitter.
Based on that one tweet, the hashtag #OscarSoWhite was trending around the world.
If anything has really powered Black Twitter, it's been humor.
If your food ain't right, oh, we're going to tell you about that, too.
We tend to create change, create culture and cool.
That's how movements happen on Black Twitter and go beyond more than that.
Black Twitter, the Twitterverse that changed a generation. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme,
The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
Let's bring in our partners at the Weather Channel.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
Feel the forecast, streaming on CBS News.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
The carnage in our nation's schools has become painfully repetitive.
Not one more child!
School shootings have parents fighting mad.
I promised my daughter I was going to fight. It's going to keep on happening.
And teachers taking lessons in how to fight back.
This is an exercise.
We approach it as it's you or them.
It shouldn't have to be your teacher's job to protect your life.
But will the battle over gun control,
People are afraid that they're going to lose their gun rights altogether.
be the hardest lesson of all?
The exercise, you're having to shoot at an adult. Are you prepared to have to kill one of your students?
Guns in the Classroom, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She's the most successful alpine skier, male or female, ever, and a worldwide inspiration.
We need a lot of women doing sports really, really well.
The story of Michaela Schifrin's game-changing reign at the top of the slopes when we go person to person.
Welcome back to America Decides. As President Biden's re-election campaign continues, what role will Vice President Harris play in 2024? Joining us now is Ashley Etienne. Ashley is a CBS News political contributor and former communications director for Vice President Harris and Speaker Pelosi. Ashley, Politico reported today that the Biden re-election campaign wants to do a, quote, Harris reset and give voters another look at the vice president. How do you react to that?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, folks are quoting polls all over the place about how she's faring worse than any other vice president. I think it's not a fair comparison. First, she's broken the mold as the first woman of color in the job. But secondly, this is the first time the political opposition has invested in tearing down and attacking the vice president of the United States. So it's definitely a concern of the White House, and they should be very concerned about it. But I wouldn't overinvest in the polling. I think the key, though, is to figure out strategically how you're utilizing her. Right now, it's hyper-focused on issues. I really believe they should focus on constituencies that she actually energizes. There's a recent CBS poll that saw and found that she's at 60+% with young voters and 70+% with liberals. So my argument would be, don't hyper-focus on one particular issue. Utilize her to drive out those two key constituencies that are going to make the difference in the next election and really help shore up Joe Biden's negatives with those key constituencies.
And when the president's campaign uses a word like reset, do you consider that at the margins an insult, as if the vice president has to do something better than she did before? Or is it a tacit admission by the president's reelection campaign that the White House may not have used her to the maximum benefit?
No, I think it's an admission that the polls aren't, she's not polling very well, and that there's some work that needs to be done there. And I completely agree with that. But I think here's the thing is they've got to retool the playbook. We can't use the old political playbook and the old model where you overinvest in the president and ignore the vice president. Now is the time to really invest in the vice president and lifting up her profile. And what I mean by that is I think the larger Democratic apparatus, as well as the White House, needs to put some resources behind elevating the vice president's work. What does that look like? That can be ads micro-targeted to these key constituencies. It could also include more talking more about what the vice president's doing from the podium every day, if that's possible, even bringing the vice president to the podium. But here's the other thing, Major, that I find very interesting. You know, as you mentioned, I work for Speaker Pelosi, and she makes this point all the time that women in politics have to have a counterpunch. And with the GOP and all their candidates coming after the vice president, I think that is the real question. How is she going to address these attacks head on? You've seen where Joe Biden has reframed his age as a positive by referring to it as experience. So the question is, how is she going to really address these attacks head on? She has to do that. But I think the key, though, is to really start investing some resources in promoting what the vice president is doing, going around traditional media, really going directly to these key voters and letting them know, unfiltered from the media, what she's actually doing on issues that they care about. And I think that's going to make a marked difference.
Actually, you've made general reference to the polls. Let's drill down them on a little bit. A CBS News poll, 42% of Democrats told us at the moment they're not in favor of the president seeking re-election. And the top reason for them, 45%, said they don't want him to run for re-election because they doubt whether he could finish a second term. Does that kind of sentiment within the Democratic Party, by its very nature, meaning it exists and it exists in prominent, unignorable numbers, mean that part of this reset or part of this reintroduction is voters viewing Vice President Kamala Harris as a possible successor in a second term for the Biden presidency, if there is one? Is that part of the reframing that has to occur?
Well, I think we should just take a step back and really look at the numbers. As you said, let's take a deep dive. 56% of Democrats support the president running again. I think that matters. The president's also polling higher than Donald Trump, consistently polling higher than his opposition, the lead opposition on the Republican side. So that actually matters. I think that they're less concerned about the polling as it relates to the president, but more concerned about really positioning the vice president as an asset to the president. You know, I worked for the vice president, and that was what we started to do from day one, which is to position her as an asset to the president. Now I think they have to figure out what's the playbook, how do we invest more resources in really conveying that message that she actually is an asset to the president and to the whole of the party.
And in that conversation about whether or not the vice president is or isn't an asset, NBC poll, I will summarize it briefly. 32% had a positive, net positive for the vice president, 49% net negative. That's a 17-point net negative, the lowest for any sitting vice president in the history of that NBC polling. Those are bad numbers. And I know you know this, Ashley. One of the hardest things in politics is for serious people to take bad numbers seriously. It's counterintuitive. You don't want to do it. You don't want to believe it because it hurts. It's hurtful. Does the vice president believe these bad numbers? And does she believe they accurately reflect her current standing?
Well, I mean, I would just say, you know, I've been in Democratic politics for 20 years, and I never found a poll to be hurtful, Major. So I just sort of would challenge that.
I understand. It's data. It's data. But you've got to believe it even when it's bad, or especially when it's bad.
I mean, here's the thing. It's, there's also internal polling that's probably runs counter to what the public polling is. But the reality is I think the beauty of the Biden approach to politics is to really keep your head down and block out all the noise. All these polls, especially this early on, is just a bunch of noise. I think the question is he's kept his head down, focused on the work, as well as the vice president. She's going all over the country talking about an issue that's very important to women, reproductive rights. But I think the question is, how do you expand what she's talking about? How do you broaden what she's talking about and appeal to more people? I think abortion is an important issue, but it's only one among many that she can talk about. Again, if you strategically utilize her to drive out liberals and drive out young voters, that positions her to talk about guns, her leadership on guns, climate, women's economic issues, a whole host of issues that matter to the American public that would make her an even greater asset to the president, but also position her to tell a fuller story about the impact that the president has had on our lives.
Ashley, very quickly, before I let you go, how concerned is the Biden re-election campaign about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.?
From what I'm hearing internally, not at all concerned about it. I think that, the question is how do you leverage the rest of the Democratic apparatus to really define who he is and really educate voters on who he is and what he actually believes in, which is counterintuitive to what Democrats really want in a candidate. So I think that's the question is how do you really educate the voters on who he actually is? I think the president and the vice president, of course, in the party aren't going to really give it much air and much attention, but there are people within the party and the apparatus who will focus on defining who he actually is. And I think once that actually happens, his numbers will drop.
Ashley Etienne, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For those of you watching really closely, and you know who you are, my hair looks different now than it did in that interview you just watched. Actually, it's the same hair. It's just a bit shorter now. No, there wasn't an intervention, but a stylist was involved. No one was harmed in the process. So, moving on, after Kevin McCarthy questioned if Donald Trump is or will be the Republicans' best choice in 2024, we will ask what effect that will have on the Speaker's ability to lead Republicans on the Hill and his ongoing, sometimes tumultuous relationship with the former president. That's next. You're streaming America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports. Controversial Congressman George Santos.
Why won't you answer our questions?
How did he manage to get elected?
Thank you very much, and God bless you, and God bless the USA.
George Santos' campaign was a campaign of deceit, lies, fabrication.
And who is he, really?
I knew him as Anthony Dvoldar from Queens.
Really, who he is, he's a fraud.
I compare him to the Tinder swindler.
From people who know him, the truth, the facts, the lies.
He would say that he was worth $100 million.
It's an incredibly cynical episode in American politics, beyond satire.
Had you ever seen anything like this?
No, and I hope I never see it again.
Campaign of Deceit, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She dazzled on the court and off the court as a businesswoman. Thank you for joining us on Person to Person. Tennis superstar and entrepreneur Serena Williams.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
I asked my students, what are we going to do about racism in the United States?
The backlash over teaching about racism in American schools.
I don't think it has any place in the classroom.
We can either pretend and say, no, we're not racist and we're all great people, or we can actually start to do the really, really hard work of addressing it.
How did you lose your job?
I made the statement that white privilege is a fact.
Is it helping diversity and inclusion?
When you bring in different people's stories and experience, it enriches education.
If you don't talk about something, it doesn't go away.
Or driving us further apart?
What schools are doing to our children in the name of anti-racism is in fact teaching them racism.
The intention is to put us in this war against each other.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
I was entitled to equal pay for equal work under the law.
Does the Supreme Court's power need to be checked?
9 Supreme Court justices, 5 of them said no, she's not entitled. That's not right.
calls to fix the court tend to go along with the politics of the moment.
Republican-appointed justices have all tended to go in one direction, with the Democratic-appointed justices tending to go in another.
Even though it's only 9 justices, it takes 5 of them to make the law of the land.
Does it have political impact? True. Political intent? Probably not true.
If the American people don't trust the judgment of their court, that's a real problem for our democracy.
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now.
On our places, bright, shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my 2 good friends, and we talk about the world.
The question is he the strongest to win the election? I don't know that answer, but can anybody beat Biden? Yeah, anybody can beat Biden. Can Biden beat other people? Yes, Biden can beat him.
Welcome back to America Decides. There is more reaction tonight, and that's putting it mildly, to House Speaker Kevin McCarthy's equivocal comments about whether or not Donald Trump, the former president, is the Republicans' best choice in 2024. Former House Speaker Paul Ryan, also a Republican, went on CNBC Wednesday morning and was asked his thoughts.
So I don't have that job anymore. So I'm very clear with, look, it's a disaster if we nominate Trump. You know, I think that I've been saying this for a long time. But Liz is right, which is he could win. I think we lose with him. I think we're much more likely to lose. We haven't won anything with him since he first won in 2016.
Speaker Ryan was referring to Liz Cheney, who made remarks about the former president, saying he could win the Republican nomination. For more on all this, CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane joins us now. Scott, the big question is, it's clearly a riff. The former president's campaign is not happy about any equivocation from Speaker McCarthy about the political potency of Trump in any venue, at any time, at any hour of any day. McCarthy's tried to walk it back. Is this a teeny moment or a possibly bigger moment?
He's really flooding the zone, isn't he? Kevin McCarthy's just saying more rather than saying, you know, I withdraw those remarks. Let me say something different now. He's told another interviewer that Trump is now stronger than he was in 2016, trying to balancing out his equivocation from earlier. Here's the bottom line. When he returns to Washington after next week's recess, Kevin McCarthy is returning to a narrow Republican majority with some ardent Trump supporters in that faction of House Freedom Caucus members. And he has got to flood the zone or allow them to flood the zone with impeachment expungement resolutions to support Trump, impeachment resolutions against members of the Biden administration to try to counterbalance, and efforts to continue to criticize, if not villainize, those who've gone after President Trump in the past, including Adam Schiff. At remarks in Ohio today with other House Republicans, listen to what the House Speaker had to say about Adam Schiff.
Our message to the committee is this is not a place for partisanship. This is a place to make sure America is safe for the future. Look at what our adversaries are doing. Look where the investment needs to be made. There was mistakes by the past leader of that committee. We watched that committee miss from Afghanistan and other. They were more focused on partisan political maneuvers. And you've got to understand, coming in as chairman after that time, after what Adam Schiff has broken that committee, was a really difficult task. But look at what transpired from there.
Really priming the pump with some of his Freedom Caucus members there. He speaks again tomorrow in Columbiana County, Ohio, a bastion of Trump supporters. Let's see if he goes another step and says more about the former president.
Scott, there's an assumption, and I'm not sure if it's well grounded in reality, that if former President Trump were to flip some switch, he could jeopardize the standing of Speaker McCarthy. Is that really true?
Feels like the breakaway caucus of House Freedom Caucus members, those who didn't come over and vote for Kevin McCarthy at all to be Speaker, those who were most strident in their opposition to that debt ceiling compromise, have the capacity to galvanize others, but not a critical mass, not by the dozens, not people outside the Freedom Caucus. It's unclear how they could use their leverage to oust Kevin McCarthy, even if Donald Trump said to do so. We haven't seen evidence of that yet, but we can tell, Major, they are restive. They have Trump on their minds, and they have been unequivocal about that.
So you talked about impeachment, either expungement or impeaching people in the Biden administration. Is there any governing that's going to go on in the month of July that we should keep our eye on?
The House will pass resolutions. They will pass bills that may stand no chance in the U.S. Senate, but they will do some legislating. They just won't do any lawmaking. Nothing seems to be coming down the pike that senators and House members will easily agree upon. They will move to try more impeachments. Marjorie Taylor Greene told us that she's going to move on Merrick Garland, who, by the way, will appear September 20th before the House Judiciary Committee to answer their questions. They're going to try to move on the U.S. Attorney in the District of Columbia, the Homeland Security Secretary, the FBI Director, ultimately on President Biden. It's a matter of when, not if, they'll try. Whether it gets to a vote on the House floor, that's a little less clear.
Also, they have to pass appropriations bills, and as I see in my email, certain progressive groups are saying there are riders on those appropriations bills that could gum up the works and make the prospect of a government shutdown at least something worth keeping an eye on.
More likely than not at this point, the prospect of a government shutdown. The House and Senate are speaking two different languages when it comes to spending bills. The House wants to cut it back to 2022 levels. Senators want to more robustly fund things. Look for this over the next 48 hours, Major. I'm told, look for Democrats to make an issue over FAA funding. The FAA administrator warned during an appropriations hearing a couple months ago there was going to be this type of chaos in the skies this week or some week in the future because of staffing issues and funding issues. For Democrats to make that an issue as they fight for funding bills over the next few weeks.
Funding that must be appropriated, therefore approved by Congress. Scott McFarlane, as always, we thank you. Well, that does it for today. You can stream America Decides Monday to Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You already knew this, but I want to remind you, you're streaming CBS News.
It's a history-making meeting. 4 extraordinary women who are all 4-star generals and admirals. How did you deal with being discriminated against?
I just worked harder.
The future of an ever-evolving U.S. military when we go